Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Sabbath. Welcome to Cincinnati East. Welcome to those on the webcast. We're happy to have you here today. There are times in our lives that, to be honest, we can have where we have certain trials that can really shake our trust in God, right? Our trust that He's there for us, and our trust that, He cares for us. Have you ever had any of those moments? Can't stand up here and say that I haven't. I've definitely had those moments where it's hard, maybe you're looking for a job for a long time, lost a job, or a series of events that just seem to be, very difficult, a long health trial. Sometimes these things, as we're growing and struggling with overcoming, are difficult. And they can affect our relationship with God. Faith doesn't just happen as soon as we're baptized. I remember, I probably shared this story before. When I was baptized, I thought, okay, great, I got the Holy Spirit. Now I am going to be a powerhouse of a Christian. But that's not what we signed up for, is it? Moments of testing happen throughout the rest of our lives. And those moments can give us strength. Those strengths, even when it's hard. Those moments, where we're really struggling, where we really feel weak, that's when we start to grow. When I was a kid, I remember playing baseball at the park with my dad as I was practicing, and I remember fielding, it felt like 1,000 grounders. And I remember him telling me that, once you are tired and you keep practicing, that's when you're going to start getting better. Well, there are those moments in our lives, those moments where it's hard. It's very hard. I've had one of those times recently. I know what it feels like. Well, what do you do? What do you do to get back on track? What do you do when you just need to feel grounded and trust in God again? Today I'd like to share actually one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. It's a story that has given me comfort in times of doubt and questioning. So let's take a look at it today in 2 Kings. 2 Kings 6. It's a story I actually remember reading as a kid and thinking just, as it happened, or as I read it for the first time, it just impacted me as a kid. And still, to this day, this story is just one of those stories that, I find myself turning back to. 2 Kings 6, and we'll start reading in verse 8. Now the king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted his servants, saying, "My camp will be in such and such a place." So he's basically making plans. We're going to move our troops here. And the man of God, Elisha, sent to the king of Israel, saying, "Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there." So God had given Elisha, some secret knowledge of what the king of Syria was doing. Verse 10, then the king of Israel sent someone to that place, which the man of God had told him. Thus he warned him, and he was watchful there, not just once or twice, but, this kept happening. This kept happening where the king of Syria would make a plan. Okay, I'm going to go this way and, try to set up a base here. And Elisha had already warned the king of Israel, that this is where they're going to be at. Happened more than once, more than twice, it says here. Verse 11, therefore the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled by this thing, and he called his servants and said, "Will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel?" Who is the mole? Who is being treasonous and letting Israel know exactly where we're planning to put people? Who's doing it? And his servants said, verse 12, "None, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom." God was giving him the knowledge of what was going on and what the king of Syria's plans were. Verse 13, so the king of Syria said, "Go and see where he is, that I may send and get him." And it was told him, saying, "Surely he's in Dothan." That's where he's at. He's in Dothan. Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, this is Elisha's servant, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots, and his servant said to him, "Alas, master, what shall we do?" We're surrounded. And I always picture Elisha, like sort of just like waking up and stretching and like, because his response is very, very casual. He says, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." At this point, the servant's got to be looking at the city and saying, "You mean all these weak Israelites? Is that who you're talking about?" Verse 17, "And Elisha prayed and said, 'Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see.' Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha." That just gives me chills today, Here, God was working with Elisha, and, Elisha, knew and had confidence and trust in God. The servant went out in the morning. What he saw was being surrounded by another army, an enemy army. What was going through his mind? Probably, what are the possibilities right now? Because nothing right now seems possible. These two men were, doing God's work. And God was there for them. Even when it seemed like an impossible moment, God was there for them. What's interesting, Elisha was close enough to God. He had a relationship with God. He had a faith. He already knew. He already knew what God's protection was like. He was aware. He prayed so that the servant would see, and the servant would have confidence like he did in his trust in God. It's amazing. I love that story. That story gives me, it gives me chills today because it gives us a little bit of a peek of what God is doing for us in our lives. He shows here in a time where they needed physical protection, God was there for them. Because in verse 18, when the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, "Strike the people, I pray, with blindness." And God did it. His army was there. His invisible angel army was ready to protect his two servants. Now, this isn't to say or imply that, God's servants have a guarantee of never having suffering or hardships, but to know that God is in complete control. Complete control is really comforting. It's really comforting. And, our best interests aren't always, what we see around us, because it's eternity what we're planning for today. It's eternity. We don't have to worry about it. We just need to know that God's interest in us isn't just for the here and the now and the hardships. And sometimes when we're going through those difficult trials, it's hard. It's very difficult. And it's sometimes even hard to just step back and say, what is the big picture? But it's stories like this in the Bible that give us the confidence that we can have in God. Jesus knew that the Father would have sent 12 legions of angels at his call to protect him. But it was that the will of God at the time, just like in our lives. It's so encouraging to know that, these two, surrounded by an army, had God's protection. But another thing I love about this story is that, yes, God will give us physical protection, but it's not often that, I am surrounded and I am in danger of a physical altercation. I don't know if you are. I don't know what kind of crowds you're hanging out with if you are. But it's not always physical protection we need, but God is working with us spiritually. He's working with a group of people in a spiritual manner. And when we do see his outcomes and we see him working in our lives, it builds trust and faith in him. Imagine how Elisha's servant, from that point on, his outlook on life was. Spiritually speaking, he had a trust and faith in God at that point that, it would be very sad for him if he didn't recognize the magnitude of what God was doing for them. When nothing seems possible and we're at our ends, when we're trying to figure out what God is doing in our lives, we have to take a little step back. A step back from our everyday, a step back from the nitty-gritty of life, and see the big picture. His involvement in our lives. His involvement of the plan of salvation for us and all of mankind. Let's go to Ephesians 6. When it comes to this, and we're stuck and we're struggling with the nitty-gritty of everyday life and the hardships, God says very, through Paul here very bluntly, Ephesians 6, verse 12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God," verse 13, "that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." We have committed ourselves to a life of growing and maturing spiritually. For us as living in this land that God has blessed, it's hard to be uncomfortable. It's hard to have a little bit of, suffering. But we've committed ourselves. Every day we have committed ourselves to doing whatever it takes to gain eternity. Every day, even when we encounter the, mundane days, I got up, I cleaned the bathroom, I made meals, I went to bed. Every day, we are preparing for eternity. We have a spiritual allegiance to God and His plan for all of mankind. When we focus on the nitty-gritty of life, it is hard. It's hard to step back and see the big picture. But that's what it takes. Elisha's servant got to see that. He got to step back and see that there is a spiritual work happening behind the scenes that is hard for us to see sometimes. What's exciting about that story, Elisha's servant, he was like, what are we going to do? And he wasn't alone. He wasn't alone. Elisha was there. Elisha was there, and he prayed for him so that he could see. He prayed that he could see. God has called us to be together, to be there for each other. Oftentimes being here, it's not about us. It's not about us. It's about, how can I be there for someone else? How can I be there and help someone else in their times of need? I've experienced that. I've experienced, struggling and others being there. And it's encouraging to know that God is working with other people in a manner that, they want to help. And Elisha was there for his servant. He would have been fearful if he had to face all that on his own. But he had Elisha there with him. It comes back to the fact that, we are being tested spiritually, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing to be able to grow in faith, isn't it? During those difficult times of life, it's hard. It's hard. But we have to remember that we have a God who does love us and wants to give us eternity. And to do so, we have accepted a life of overcoming and testing, which includes some trials that can be difficult. These two men, and I think in the story of 2 Kings, shows that God does care for those who He is working with and who He's working through. He's intimately involved. In fact, there's a story right before that. If we can go back to 2 Kings, right before that, that shows that God cares for even the little things. In 2 Kings 6, just starting in verse 1, it says that the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, "See, now the place where we dwell with you, it's too small for us." Okay? This seems like an everyday, thing happening here. We're staying in this place, it's too little. What are we going to do about it? Verse 2, please let us go to the Jordan. Let every man take a beam from there, and let us make there a place where we may dwell. So he answered, go. Verse 3, then one said, please consent to go with your servants. And he answered, I will go. So he went with them, and when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. Seems like an everyday, you're working on something, you drop the tool that's, wedged inside the hood of the car, down in the engine. This seems like something, that could happen to any of us. So they're cutting down trees. The axe head fell in the water. And he cried out and said, alas, master, for it was borrowed. I borrowed that. It's not mine. So the man of God said, where did it fall? And he showed him the place. So he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. This story is so easy to just read past and think, okay, yeah, that's interesting, cute story. But, it shows a lot that, God cares for even the little things that we're going through. I remember when Judy and I were first married, I was still growing and, still learning as we all are through our lives. And I remember having conversations with her, like, when I pray, it's hard for me to ask God for something little that seems meaningless to anything that has to do with, His plan, or how can I pray for something so little? And we had conversations about it, and her dad and I, had conversations about it, and one day we were, I had lost a Frisbee in a field, and her dad said, well, I'll go look for it. And I was like, I looked for countless hours for that thing, and I didn't see it. And he went out there in 5 minutes, came back. I was like, how did you find it? Where was it? He's like, well, I prayed about it, and I just went out there and I found it. Okay. But I did, I think that I finally, that moment, I did learn, it's okay to pray for the little things too. It's okay, because God does care. He is intimately involved in our lives. And He is so big and powerful that He can answer the big prayers when we're really suffering, and also the little ones. When we're struggling and we're trying to figure out possibilities, He's there, even a lost Frisbee in a field. There are times in our lives that can be, really draining. We can really be struggling, physically, mentally, spiritually. And it's easy, I don't know how it is for you, it's easy for me to want to run or become lethargic spiritually. But that's the opposite of what we're supposed to do. It's the opposite of what we should do. Opening our Bible is where we can regain strength. Faith comes by hearing of the Word of God. This story in 2 Kings of that invisible army is one of my favorite stories to go to and during that time. It's a great place to go, God's Word, in those times when nothing seems possible.